Hello and welcome to Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television and in books. And today I want to talk about Dracula, and I want to talk about multiple readings of Dracula and multiple interpretations of the text. And this isn't a video just about Dracula. This is a video talking through the number of times I've said, you can have these different readings, these different interpretations of text. And it goes to this point that I have made before, that a narrative is actually constructed by the reader. And it's why when a reader is certainly age, say 13 and reads a book, and then 23 and reads the book, or later on in their life when they're 63 and they read a book, the book doesn't change. The text doesn't change, but the narrative does. The meaning that we ascribe to the narrative changes depending on our perspective. It also explains why when we all read the same book, we draw different things from it. We understand the context of the novel differently. We understand the narrative differently. We have different reader experiences. And all of this ties into this idea of multiple readings. And one of the things that academics do, that critics do, is apply critical lenses, apply different interpretations to a text. Sometimes they are mutually exclusive. Sometimes they draw forth information. You go, how did you get that? You are just overreading things in a text. And this video is kind of a way to explain, using Dracula, how you can draw multiple things from a text. And once you start picking at one thread, once you start looking at one aspect of it, suddenly the entire narrative recontextualizes and you get a different view of what is being discussed. You get a different idea of what the novel is actually about. You get these different meanings. The narrative becomes different. And this is not about overreading or reading too much into the text. This is about understanding that metaphors and symbols and narrative events can be constructed in different ways, all depending on the knowledge, experience, and intent of the reader. So why Dracula? Dracula is a fascinating and very malleable text. And, it's a 19th century text. I'm not going to be spoiling anything for people here because it has been adapted, I don't know, a gajillion times. Everyone knows the story of Dracula, but surprisingly, very few people have read the actual book. And the reason I know this is when I've taught Dracula in the past, one of the first questions I ask undergraduates are, what are the weaknesses of vampires in Dracula? And, like stake through the heart and silver and, can be destroyed by sunlight. And you go through all of these things. And then you point out that a bunch of these are not actually in the text, that these are modern conceptions and misconceptions about what was in the text. Because Dracula is not allergic to sunlight. And it's a big one. It drives me nuts. That actually, I think, comes more from the Hollywood sort of rip-off of Dracula, Nosferatu, where Count Orlok is damaged by the sunlight. And that ties into a whole metaphor about the sun being God's light and of truth and good, and he is a creature of the night and evil and bad. But that's all beside the point. What I want to talk about is Dracula and how we can interpret Dracula in different ways. So if we think about Dracula from the sort of the first reading, the first time you attempt to read the novel, what do you get out of it? And like so many things, the very first time that we read through a text, the first time we experience a novel, quite often we focus on the narrative events. We focus on plot, the sequence of narrative events that occur in the book as they are explored by characters, as they move through various settings. That is what we focus on. What is going to happen next? And in this, it's a relatively straightforward story in that Dracula, this count from Transylvania, has hired a solicitor, is buying land in England. He's going to move across. He then seduces women, gets chased out of England by our ostensible heroes, who are Dr. Seward, Quincy Morris, Dr. Seward, who is the middle-class, well-educated doctor, Quincy Morris, who is the American entrepreneur and industrialist, and Arthur Godalming, who is the sort of the landed gentry in England. And we can see how they represent the different classes. as well as Mina and Jonathan Harker, and they are led by Van Helsing, Abraham Van Helsing. And they chase Dracula away from England and ultimately defeat him. That's what happens in the story. It's a supernatural horror ghost story kind of thing, and yeah, it's great. There's a reason it has lasted this long. There's a reason it has had such an impact on vampire mythology, far more so than some of the earlier vampire stories. But vampire stories were very popular at that time in England. This wasn't the very first vampire story, there were others. But that's the first way of reading Dracula. And it is very much, and this will sound harsh, but that is a superficial reading. That is looking at the surface level of what is happening in Dracula. And if you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I'm very interested in what happens beneath the surface, other meanings we can derive from it. Did Stoker intend us to see other things? Not necessarily, but they are there. There are undercurrents running through this text that we can use various critical lenses in various ways to pick up on this information, to see why it had such resonance, why it affected people in the way that it did, and why it still has resonance today. So we can start by thinking about it in terms of general themes, because themes quite often reveal other aspects. So one of the themes that we can look at is gender and sexuality, and this is quite important. Vampires, particularly as we've seen over the last century or so, have become increasingly associated with gender and sexuality, with the idea of being penetrated, of swapping bodily fluids, the transmission of blood, the whole idea of life and unlife being associated with all of this. And we can see it very much as a metaphor or a symbol for sexual congress, for intimate relations. And that's not startling. The idea of penetration and the swapping of bodily fluids, of these mysterious, dark, powerful, mesmerizing strangers creeping into the bedroom and seducing people, that is not overreading the text. That is something that's very much present in the text. And we can see this explicitly followed in Dracula, because first of all, Jonathan Harker is seduced and penetrated by the three sort of vampire brides in Dracula's castle. We see Dracula finding Lucy Westenra, and Lucy already has three suitors. She has the young lord, the young English lord, Arthur. She has Quincy, the American industrialist, and she has Dr. Seward, the English middle-class, well-educated professional, all pursuing her. She is the prize of what they desire. And it's all above board, but it seems strange that she's slightly loose, Lucy being slightly loose. Oh, there's a little bit of a play on words. But she's entertaining three suitors at the same time. Oh my. But they all lose Lucy to the foreign invader, to the foreign immigrant who comes in and seduces her at night. The strange count who sneaks into her bedroom and penetrates her and damages her and corrupts her and changes her from being this beautiful, wonderful, desirable English woman into a monstrous other. She is corrupted by sexual congress outside of wedlock because she has a physical affair with this foreigner. And are you overreading the text to pick up on that? No, that's actually very, very blatant in the text. And she becomes monstrous. She becomes a danger to children. She becomes this terrifying, both seductive, but also disturbing and evil creature that preys on children, is damaging children. She becomes an evil mother, a bad mother, because she shunned the attentions of the acceptable suitors the English lord, the American industrialist, and the English professional. She has shunned all of them in favor of the foreigner, the immigrant, and married outside of her station. And that ties into some of the Victorian anxieties at this time. We can also see it in terms of race, because you can see how that is tying into this. That, yes, she rejects these three acceptable suitors for the foreigner. And if you think the British Empire at one stage, basically ruled a third of the planet, and all of these colonized nations were sending people backwards and forwards between England, the center, and these outlying colonies. So there was a fear in England, an anxiety in England about the influx of immigrants. Something to bear in mind, that this is not an anxiety only from today, that people keep trotting this out as a fear and anxiety that our lives will be disrupted, corrupted, and destroyed by foreign influences, by new people with new cultures and new traditions coming in and changing our lives and bringing new things. This is very much an expression of that anxiety, because Lucy is corrupted by the foreigner. And we see then that the major sort of instigating action for a lot of the rest of the novel is Dracula's fixation then on Mina, on this pure new woman she is a professional, she is educated, but she is married properly. She's married to Jonathan Harker. And now the foreigner is trying to break up that marriage, is trying to destroy that marriage, is trying to destroy the sanctity of womanhood and marriage in England. That's the fear that is being exploited. So we've moved from gender and sexuality to talking about the fear of the invader, the fear of this foreign influence. Now, there's another element that gets explored, particularly in a lot of later vampire fiction, that has a lot to do with how it's depicted in Dracula, and that is homoeroticism. Because when we think of the vampires penetrating the various heroes and female heroes in this, think of how Jonathan Harker has both the fear and the ecstasy of being penetrated by the three female vampires, this transgressive notion of what sexuality is. Think of how mesmerizing and attractive and handsome Count Dracula is when he appears in London, when they see him in the daytime. And he has become young, he has become attractive, he is dressed as a dapper gentleman. All of these things are tied into this anxiety around homosexuality. And this was written at a time when Oscar Wilde basically was sentenced to hard time for being gay. And this is very, very difficult for modern readers to grasp, that homosexuality has only so very recently been decriminalized. This is a social anxiety that runs through a lot of literature, and you could not write about it openly. That was very, very dangerous. It would have your book banned or viewed in a very certain way. So a lot of it gets codified, a lot of it gets disguised. And one of the ways of disguising it is using metaphor and symbol. So the idea that this vampire penetrates, all vampires penetrate, is a way of exploring homosexuality and homoeroticism in texts with a cover in place, with an excuse. Oh, no, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about vampires. And it is a way of exploring that. And I'll return to both these points in a minute. But then one of the last major themes in this is disease. And of course, that is tied into race, that is tied into invasion narratives, and it's tied into sexuality, because the permissive free love or having multiple suitors leading to becoming diseased and monstrous and dying, that these foreign invaders coming in with their dirty diseases is, again, being explored in Dracula. And the Victorians were petrified of disease, much like, we've been living through a pandemic. Disease is so frightening because it is not easy to contain. And if you look at a lot of the rhetoric surrounding the recent pandemic, how much of it was blamed on foreigners, how much of it was blamed on people traveling, and it was, well, if everyone just stayed where they should be, then none of this would have happened. There are fears and anxieties about disease because disease is so powerful. We are so powerless against it in so many respects that we find a way to personify it. We find a way to find a target to blame for it because we cannot blame and fight the disease directly. So we blame others. And that is something that runs through all of this, that runs through Dracula. That Dracula has brought in this disease of vampirism. He has infected Lucy. He is trying to infect Mina. Harker is nearly brought low by vampirism because of the three vampire brides. And it is only through Mina nursing him back to health that he is in any way okay by the end, because the good, pure relationship and marriage between Mina and Jonathan is what saves him, the love of a good woman, instead of that aberrant lifestyle he had indulged, sowing his wild oats in Europe on his gap year and his trip around Europe that he did before settling down properly. Oh, was that metaphor a little too on the nose? So we can see these themes are being explored. And what ties a lot of this together is when we think of Dracula as being part of the Gothic tradition, Gothic novels. So roughly 18th century kind of is when they take off, and they become very, very popular in the 19th century. These supernatural stories, these horror stories, these stories that focused on aspects of immorality, that focused on the tension between horror and enlightenment, between enjoyment and fear, that it was a way of exciting the mind and making us afraid at the same time. They talked about the sublime. But a lot of the focus of the Gothic was on sensuality and sexuality and immorality and decadence. And it was almost a counterpoint to a lot of the religious narratives and the religious allegories and these moral tales that were being told, that were emphasizing live the correct life, live the proper way. And a lot of the Gothic stories explored more dangerous, darker, sumptuous, and delectable stories about human frailty and immorality and indulging in the dark and in desires. And that is part of what Dracula as a novel is part of, that it is about these anxieties, it is about exploring these taboos, because one of the things that literature does is it takes a taboo, it takes something that we don't talk about, and it explores it, and it tries to tell us these things in a way that is subtle, that is disguised, so that we have an excuse for it. Oh no, it's just a ghost story. Oh no, it's just supernatural. Oh no, it's just horror. But it is exploring a taboo. There is a frisson and a tension and a delight in indulging in subjects and topics that we dare not talk about in public. And of course, public discourse has changed radically in the past 150 years. But we can see this being used time and time again. We use literalized metaphors. We take these metaphors, we take these topics, we disguise them, and we place them in stories so that we can explore them and examine them and play with them in a very safe way without actually having to suffer the repercussions of doing something that is taboo, that is outside the social norm. And we see that in Dracula. That is part and parcel of the Gothic. That is part and parcel of what literature does. And none of this is overreading the text. None of this is denying that surface level reading of it being a horror story about a vampire and then they chase it out and then they win. All of it is in the text. These are themes and subcurrents within the text. So let's talk about why these things are so important. And when we think of the social anxieties of the Victorian era, their anxiety about the rise of the new woman, the suffrage movement of women after women rising in demanding education, the right to vote, having their own job, having agency, having freedom to pursue what they want to pursue rather than being dependent on fathers and brothers and sons to decide things. That this was something that was disrupting the social order as established in England, in a lot of the world at the time, that patriarchal norm. And that causes anxiety. While we see it very much as a good thing, everyone should be entitled to agency in their own lives. But when we disrupt social norms, that creates anxiety, even when we know the disruption is necessary, even when we know it is progress, that creates anxiety. And instead of writing a novel very directly, well, this is about women's suffrage, this is about the tension within society when women get the vote. That is very matter of fact. And you do have novels like that, but we can use art to disguise that. We can use a metaphor to talk about it. So in this, we have Lucy, loose Westerner. Lucy Westenra, loose Westerner. Like, that, it's fairly blatant. And she is courting 3 separate men at the same time. The harlot. She is entertaining 3 suitors. That's a little bit risque for the time, is it not? And in it, not only is she courting the 3 suitors publicly and entertaining these 3 different gentleman callers, but she's also entertaining a 4th suitor at night in secret in her bedroom without a chaperone. And oh dear, now we see her as rejecting the social norms, rejecting the moral way to conduct yourself and engaging in risque behavior, taboo behavior. This is the danger of a woman being able to access her own sexuality. Look what happens to Lucy, the loose Westerner. She indulges in all of these things and becomes monstrous. That is terrible. And then we have Mina, or Mina, which would be Irish for woman. Mina, again, has this marriage to Jonathan Harker by the midpoint of the book. Now, Jonathan has been allowed to indulge sowing his wild oats in his tour of Europe. He has had congress with these 3 vampire women, and he's come back with a bit of a disease, and he needs some treatment. He needs some antibiotics to clear all that up before he gets married. But that's okay because he's a man, he's allowed to do these things. Mina, on the other hand, has to be the dutiful wife to nurse him back to health. And we can see how that plays into what a man is allowed to do, what a man's sexuality is before he gets married. He's allowed to go and indulge in these things, but a woman has to remain pure. We can see that Victorian sensibility. And it is the love of a good woman that nurses him back to health. So we see that, again, this literalized metaphor. And this is not, again, this is not overreading what is in the text. This is paying attention to what is in the text, and it is paying attention to this anxiety within the Victorian era about what a woman should do, how a woman should act, the role of a woman in society. And we see that Mina, through her dedication to her husband, is venerated. She is described as saint-like, whereas Lucy becomes a monster. So that is a point to bear in mind. But also, Mina is then subject to the unwanted attentions of this foreign invader. He is trying to break up the marriage between Mina and Jonathan. He is trying to destroy that institution, that precious institution of marriage, through coming in with his foreign ways and his dapper hat and his silly little glasses. That he's coming in and disrupting all of that. And that, again, is this anxiety within Victorian society about the invader, this anxiety about these things. And it is literalized. It gives us a way to explore that. But we see in the text, Mina, despite her protestations that, oh no, I don't want this, is being seduced by it. And here's the danger. Here's the danger that that Stoker is placing in the text. There is an allure to the new, the other, the strange, and oh my. And we can see that titillation. We can see that, oh yes, we must say no. We must say no. This is terrible. But secretly, we want to explore it. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of this, literalizing the metaphor about exploring taboos. So there's another aspect of it. But let's move beyond that and look at other aspects of the Victorian age that are of interest here. And one of the tensions that we see is the tension between the old and the new, because we have Arthur, Lord Godalming, is very much representative of the noble tradition in England. He is a noble. He is Sir Arthur Godalming. He has inherited the estate. He is a lord. And then we have Quincy. And Quincy Morris is the industrialist, the entrepreneur from America. He is new money. He isn't established. He isn't, he's worked his way up by his bootstraps, or, let's not get into the whole colonial aspect of how Quincy made his money in slaves, molasses, and rum. But a lot of that is about this influx from the New World, the power of money, which is no longer associated with the gentry, but is actually the new money, the new colonies, how this has come across. And that is a disruption. But in some ways, while he is brash, while he is arrogant, he's good-hearted and he's slightly acceptable. And then we have Seward, the professional, well-educated, a doctor. Now, he doesn't have the family name, he doesn't have that background, but he is a member of society. He is respected. And we can see the class structure represented in all of these acceptable suitors for Lucy. Lucy, who in some ways is being representative here of England, that there are these different structures all vying for her attention, all vying for her future. And she rejects them all, obviously in favor of the Count, and becomes monstrous. That's the danger of choosing the wrong thing. But we see that tension about the class structure, and that ties into this old versus new. Dracula very much represents the old, from a cultural backwater, from a rural backwater, from a technological backwater. It takes weeks for correspondence to reach him. He is dependent on horse and cart to get around, not modern conveyances like trains. He can't use telegrams. He doesn't have access to modern technology. He chooses to sail in a sailing ship with sails rather than the steamships that the heroes employ, because England is now the center of this technological future. And, we may quibble and laugh about the fact that telegrams were viewed as futuristic, but the idea of near instantaneous communication, which we take for granted now, we see from Dracula's perspective, is miraculous. And he is unaware of it. He is locked into the past. And the Victorian era is about moving into the future. But there's still a tension here. The past is attractive. The past is seductive. The future is actually quite frightening. We don't know how things are changing. The new woman is an aspect of that. The industrialization of the nation is an aspect of that. The influx of all of these foreign workers to work in the factories is an aspect of this thing that is causing anxiety. So that is part and parcel of what is being explored. And of course, you can say, but none of this is in the text. But you can see how all of these things play into the anxieties, play into the tensions. And only with a very subtle shift can we see why that is still relevant today, why we see this fear about technology moving too quickly. Yes, it allows me to record this video and post it on YouTube. But at the same time, what happened to the good old-fashioned family values? What happened to sitting around and talking to your friends? Why are we spending so much time on our phones? Technology in and of itself provides a new future, but that means letting go of the past. And that can be problematic, that can be painful, and that can induce anxiety. So let's think of another way of looking at this text. And this is one of those readings that I find very, very persuasive about the text. And it's part of the post-colonial Anglo-Irish reading of Dracula. Because All of what I've been discussing thus far is treating Dracula by Bram Stoker very much as an English novel, as part of Victorian England, because I've conflated Victorian and the English. And most people do that. When we think of Victorian England, we think very much of London. We think of Oliver Twist. We think of that setting. But Stoker was from Ireland. He's an Irish author. And yes, he was living in England, but he is Irish. And Ireland is not the same as England. And in this, we have Stoker as an Irish person speaking English, hence Anglo-Irish. But there is something here that is very, very different to the English sensibilities. And once you start paying attention to that, it changes a lot of the ways that we can interpret Dracula. So one of the fears that Dracula has is that as he speaks, although he can speak fluent English, he has a very heavy accent. When Stoker moved to England to work in London, to work in the theatre, he was made fun of for his accent, very explicitly, in print, in one of the society magazines, and I think it was the Tatler, said that he sounded like he was an Irish orangutan who talked about his double entendres instead of double entendre. And they made fun of him. They compared him to a monkey. They compared him to an ape, an orangutan. And when we think about that, think of one of the major scientific breakthroughs that was popular at this time, that was well known at this time, that people were talking about at this time, Darwin's theory of evolution. And that diagram of the ape slowly turning into a man, and this concept of the English thinking of themselves as the most evolved, and everyone else was lower down on that evolutionary scale. And that's why they viewed their lessers, or their perceived lessers, as being like apes, ape-like. That's where a lot of that imagery comes from. And there's a lot of political cartoons from that time that show the Irish as monstrous, as ape-like, as bestial, in comparison to the beautiful and elevated English. And that is something that needs to be borne in mind when we look at the descriptions of Dracula. His smelly breath, his dirty fingernails, his dirt, he's smelly, he's disgusting. All of these things associated with him. He's bestial, he has an animal magnetism. He is less evolved than the English. And when you think of how that gets applied to the Irish, we start to see that maybe there's a slightly more sympathetic reading of Dracula, the character, that he is in some ways coming from an agrarian, rural backwater and moving to England, much like the rural agrarian nation of Ireland. The Irish moved to England. And then added into this the descriptions of mina, the Irish for woman. Ireland is frequently described as, or personified as Erin, as this beautiful woman, or as a warrior woman. But Ireland is frequently personified as a female figure. And here we have mina, Irish for woman, literally the Irish woman. And her first part of her name is Wilhelmina, like that's her full name. And we have this conflation of William and woman. And when we think of the tension between Protestantism and Catholicism in Ireland, which I think most people are aware, there is a tension that has run through Irish history between Protestants and Catholics, we can see how Mina in some respects is representative of this Anglo-Irish state. And now we can view Dracula in a slightly different way. If Mina is representative of Erin, of this version of Ireland that is divided between Catholic and Protestant, we have a noble absentee landlord, a noble from an old tradition from the East, buying up land in the West. What is east of Ireland? England. What did a lot of the gentry do in England? They bought up land in Ireland. They were absentee landlords. They treated their tenants badly. They drained the very life from Ireland, from a certain perspective. That because of Ireland's need for agriculture, its dependence on agriculture, the very lifeblood of Ireland was tied into the soil, the deep, rich soil of Ireland that grew all of these crops. Can you see now why Dracula from the east moving west to drain the lifeblood of this country can be seen as an extended metaphor talking about the English draining the lifeblood from Ireland? And again, I'm not trying to make a political statement about this. I'm talking about this book in context in the 19th century. But you can see why that becomes a very interesting aspect. And this tension then between Dracula as an immigrant, which creates a very sympathetic portrayal, and then the mutually exclusive view of him, Dracula, as the villain. And this reflects this tension in the Anglo-Irish, at once longing to be accepted by the colonial master, and at the same time resenting and hating the colonial master. It's this tension. The Irish speak English. And one of the things that actually, if you read a lot of literature written in English by Irish authors, quite a lot of these early works by these authors play with the English language in a way that a lot of the English authors wouldn't think to do, because they were playing with it. They were adapting the English language and toying with it and showing the idiosyncrasies and the fallacies. I think it's, what's that book? Murphy. And it's Murphy walked into a mew. And obviously the word in English is mews, M-E-W-S, which, is used for a street, but it comes originally from the word for stables, plural, but now it is a singular street. So in the book, Murphy walks into a mew. The English is being corrected by the author because he's playing with it. And that's one of the things that we see in a lot of Irish literature, is this playfulness with language, this obsession with the English language, to be better at English than the English, because there's an inferiority complex. We also have this whole idea that the English viewed themselves as superior. We saw that in the political cartoons. And this is a prevalent thing that runs through the book. So when we think of Dracula, one of the things that I haven't talked about, and it's going to be relevant to this sort of Anglo-Irish discussion, is its format as an epistolary novel. It is written in passages of prose that mimic modern novels, but it also has excerpts from newspapers. It has correspondence. It has diary entries, transcripts of interviews. This is all incorporated into the novel, and the diegetic reason, the reason given in the narrative, is that the heroes have had these meetings, they've compiled all these things, and Mina has transcribed everything and written everything down and created a file, a dossier on Dracula. And obviously at this time there was the rise of the Republican movement, the importance of Ireland as a free state, or demanding home rule. These were tensions at the time that a number of Irish nationalists and Republicans were unhappy with the rule of the English. And in Dublin Castle, where Stoker had worked, they compiled dossiers on political agitators, of newspaper clippings, interviews, transcripts of witness statements, letters and correspondence that were all placed in a file that were dossiers about these political agitators, about these enemies of the state who were coming in to disrupt things, who were trying to break apart the power of the state. And suddenly we see this point of connection. This is a dossier on the political agitator of Dracula. And that is a fascinating aspect that suddenly lends itself to a reading of this text. And even the character of Abraham van Helsing. Helsing is an anagram of English, which, could be a massive coincidence. And Helsing he's Dutch. He's from the Netherlands, the home of William of Orange, of course, having a certain resonance in Ireland, this type of Protestantism, this Orange Order. So the English, again, from the east, and he's coming from the east of England, so again, it's this movement east to west, comes in. His surname is English. He's from the birthplace of William of Orange, which has resonance. And in order to defeat Dracula, he makes use of the superstitions of the Catholics. They use the communion wafer and Roman Catholic rites to sanctify the soil. But he is not a Catholic priest. He abuses this. We have this ostensible, either secular or Protestant figure, misusing the religion of another group for his own ends. And there is an aspect of Irish history where Catholics converted to Protestantism in order to get food from the Protestant soup kitchens, particularly during the potato famine. So this is an aspect, this tension between these things. And suddenly that gives a different resonance to what is going on. Now, I'm not saying that any one of these readings is the definitive reading, but I think you can see there are all of these different ways of interpreting the information. It's not just the superficial events in the text. These themes, these aspects, the historical context, the political context, the biography of Stoker, all add to different ways of understanding the text. And understanding Dracula as a sympathetic figure, representative of the Irish immigrant, trying to fit in, and then being run out of town by the established English order would, be completely contradictory to Dracula as villain. Looking at Dracula and the vampires as this whole investigation of homosexuality sort of rules out looking at it as an exploration of the new woman and gender and sexuality to do with womanhood and female empowerment. But we can hold these mutually exclusive ideas in our head at the same time. That's the power of literature. We can interpret the novel in all of these different ways, and at one time we might find one more reading more persuasive than another reading. And we can move backwards and forwards between these positions. The narrative is not fixed. The only thing that is fixed is the text itself. Narrative is found through meaning, and meaning remains flexible. And that's what I'm trying to talk about here. So I hope that you've enjoyed this. Thank you very much for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.